of the IIMA Healthcare Alumni Special Interest Group webinar series. The alumni special interest groups at IIMA are platforms that bring together alumni, faculty, students, and leverage the collective intellectual resources engaged in specific areas such as healthcare, education, technology, analytics, public policy, entrepreneurial ecosystem, etc., to bear on the most challenging issues of our times. Faculty and alumni are already making stellar contributions, but the ASIG platform allows them to collaborate with each other much more intimately and to engage with industry and practitioners in a much more multifaceted manner. To facilitate this interaction, we've created 14 ASIGs and more will follow in due course. The IIMA Healthcare ASIG webinar series brings the thoughts, views, and expertise of renowned experts to the IIMA community. These are structured as panel discussions or as dialogue between eminent speakers. In our inaugural session of the webinar, I had shared that how exceptional a job the healthcare ASIG and its members have done throughout. In the pre-COVID days, as well as since the pandemic, since the lockdown, in dealing with everything that the pandemic has thrown at it. Especially in light of the fact that the healthcare sector has had to stand up to the immense challenge of unprecedented crisis and the need to mobilize like never before. For the sector to develop innovative solutions and sustain itself in the long run, it will need support from many quarters, including from investors. And today's topic of investors' perspective on opportunities in healthcare deals with that in part. We have a distinguished panel today to address this issue and share their thoughts and perspectives on this. And the panel comprises Shashank Singh, partner and head of India Apax Partners, Dhiraj, Poddar, managing director and country head India of TA Associates, and Dr. Prem, Pavoor, partner and head of India of 8 Road Ventures. The session will be moderated by Manish Gupta, co-founder and CEO of Indegene. We look forward to an exciting session. I now hand over the platform to Manish to take over the proceedings.
Thanks a lot, Anurag. Thank you so much. So let me start off by, first of all, thanking the Healthcare SIG group and IIM Ahmedabad for inviting me to moderate a panel with such eminent panelists. It's truly a privilege to be with these gentlemen over here who not only represent some outstanding firms, but on their own rights are extremely erudite people who have a very, very nuanced perspective of various things. And I've had the privilege to interact with them for many years now. Now, before we get into this space, Anurag introduced me as co-founder of CEO of Indegene. I started Indegene more than 2 decades back with a bunch of people, and we are in the healthcare space. Till 6 months back, I used to spend a lot of my time in the United States. And one of the things which I did almost like a pilgrimage was go to some of these conferences every year to figure out what's going on. What should we be afraid of? What should we be excited about, right? And things like the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference in San Francisco. There's a conference called Drug Information Authority, DIA conference, which happens in different parts of the US. And there's a conference called HIMSS, which is one of the largest healthcare IT conferences, and a bunch of others, right? You have ASCO, which is on the oncology side, and each one of them are just humongous, right? And there is so much which was going on in the healthcare world, and it was just quite amazing to see the kind of advances which are happening. Now, on the other hand, when I was come back over here, one of the roles which I played from my company and also as part of the healthcare group was to evangelize healthcare as a sector. And to be honest, it was a bit frustrating, right? To think about, it's a $10 trillion sector with so much innovation going on, so central to our existence as human beings, and still have to put all this effort to evangelize this sector, which has so many subsectors and all this stuff. Now, that's one thing which seems to have changed over the last 6 months, right? Healthcare is in the center of pretty much every discussions, whether it's thinking about careers, it's about investments, or public policy. Now, in that context, we thought that a lot of shifts are happening across the board. It'd be really interesting to figure out and learn how some of the investment firms and people in the investment world are viewing various shifts, which includes obviously the shifts on healthcare. That got us to reach out to people and set up this panel. So once again, I would say that it's a true privilege to be on this panel with all of you. I'm going to kickstart this panel by requesting all of you to introduce your firms and also give us a sense on how things have changed from, let's say, a sectoral allocation perspective, right, at a global level in general, and then in particular for healthcare. So that would be my first question. And shall we get started with you, Shashank?
Sure, happy to, Manish. Thank you. And once again, thank you so much for inviting me. I have to start off by saying that I'm probably the least informed on healthcare here. So I'm here to probably learn as much as everybody else rather than contribute. My own background has been in technology and telecom for the last 2+ decades, and been at Apax Partners 16 years or so now. Quick background on Apax. We're a global private equity fund, the largest fund headquartered in Europe. We manage or advise about $60 billion of private equity capital. Set up in India, coming on to nearly 14 years now, and set up base here. And we have a sector-focused approach. So I guess the reason we're on the panel, I'm on the panel, is healthcare is one of the 4 sectors in which we invest globally. And indeed, it's one of the sectors that we've also invested in India, a reasonable amount. In fact, the first investment we did in India was in Apollo Hospitals, was in the healthcare provider space. That was back in 2007. And as time has evolved, a couple of years ago, we acquired also India's first and largest independent medtech company, business called Healthium Medtech, located where you are right now, Manish, in Bangalore. So there's been a whole evolution there, which I'm sure we'll talk about. To your specific question on what's happened to allocations. Now, while Apax as a firm doesn't explicitly allocate by sector or by country, we don't sort of have a fixed budget and say this proportion of this fund goes here. I think by its very nature, just observing what's happened as a result of COVID and the pandemic and the impact on both the healthcare sector as well as other sectors, there's been a natural tendency, certainly at Apax, to move more towards what I'd call defensives and sectors that are either unaffected or are benefiting from COVID. So healthcare would be one of those spaces, for the most part, that is benefiting. Technology, the broader tech space, is another sort of area that we are investing a lot more in today. If I look at our pipeline as a reflection of what will likely happen in the future. So those are 2. And healthcare in particular, I think, what the pandemic has brought to the fore is that, the sector has been underinvested, certainly from an India perspective, significantly underinvested. B, that it's supply chains which were quite fragmented, quite global in nature. The pandemic broke a lot of those down. So companies are going to have to think about their own supply chains. Where do you source? Where do you manufacture? Where do you do what activity? And that in itself has led to, things like API companies getting a lot of interest in India and so on. I'm sure we'll talk about it, but yes, definitely. The answer to your question is yes, definitely. There's been an increasing interest in healthcare, and I don't think it's a flash in the pan. I think it will continue.
Excellent. Thank you, Shashank. So shall we move on to you, Prem? I'm sure you can't say that you have been a healthcare guy out and out, right? So what is your perspective on the firm as well as how do you see the sector allocations and changes in the outlook towards investing?
No, happy to talk about that. But first, I guess, thank you, Manish. I think IIM, Ahmedabad, the Alumni Group, Sudarshan Jain for having me here. I think real privilege to be on a panel moderated by you, Manish, and also I think
Thank you.
share the call with a much more experienced set of investors. But at the highest level, I'd say in terms of introducing us, I work for a firm called 8 Roads, which is an early growth and growth stage investor. We are a firm that is completely backed by Fidelity today, the large financial services entity. And we're global in nature, present in most countries, but structured very much as country-specific funds and operations. We focus largely on 2 sectors around the world, healthcare and then technology. But healthcare by far, I would say, is the large sector of interest, has driven over the years about 40% of our investments. We're relatively active, I'd say about 120 at last count healthcare companies globally, about 20 in India. The biotech markets, both in the US as well as the markets in China, have helped. India also has contributed. We have about 20 companies that we've taken public over the last 5 years. I think a metric we're quite proud of is that our companies have contributed to 20 drugs, novel drugs that have been approved by the US FDA. So that makes us feel like we are creating some level of impact in the sector. So look, healthcare continues to be very important. And I think for all the reasons that Shashank mentioned, I think even more important as we move forward. I've been with the firm for about now 12, 13 years since I moved back from the US. And prior to that, spent several years both as an academic and then also as a consultant.
Excellent. Thank you. So on to you, Dhiraj. Now, by the way, for everyone, Dhiraj is an alum of IIMA 2002 batch. So probably not a special welcome on this panel.
No,
So
always
would love
great to
hear
be
from you,
back.
Dhiraj.
Yeah, always great to be back in some form and shape with the Institute. So I'm happy to be here and thank you for the opportunity. I'll keep it brief. I mean, look, we are a large global private equity firm. We're headquartered out of Boston, very old firm in the business. We've been around for more than 5 decades now. And it's the same fund that invests across various markets. So that's the US, Europe, and Asia. In India, we've been now active for more than 10 years. And I joined the firm about 10 odd years back to try and build the business here. The firm's mindset is late stage growth, and hence we look for very predictable businesses which can continue to scale and grow. And while there is an element of requiring predictability, there is a strong mindset to back growth. In that context, the sectors we picked, tech is a big portion of what we do. I would say healthcare comes a close second, financial services and consumer, that's sort of the mix. And healthcare has contributed to roughly a fourth of our portfolio over decades and across geographies. That's, we've never tried to actually aim for or solve for a certain allocation, which is how most global firms work. But it's ended up in that vicinity. And I think it's in some ways a reflection of the potential of the sector and the kind of opportunities we've seen. Interestingly, it's also a very big space, right? So we've seen investments in so many geographies which look very different when you look at the portfolio as a whole. So you have managed care, you have healthcare services, you have healthcare IT, there are obviously medtech and medical devices. And if you look at each country and each geography, you'll find there's a different concentration. So we've done more pharma, for instance, in India than we've done anywhere else in the world. There's obviously a lot more of managed care in the US context. But what continues to excite us remains, it's a critical sector. There is always a strong investment thesis driven by a societal need or demand, which somebody like us is able to back over a long period of time. So that's a little bit about the firm at a global level. The other part is, even in India, we've made more than a dozen investments, of which I would say 4 of them are in healthcare. And that's a couple of pharma companies, as I mentioned before, but we've been there in diagnostic businesses. We've backed an IVF chain in India. So it continues to draw, the sector continues to draw capital from private equity in general, and we find enough opportunities from our perspective to continue to chase up each year. I'll pause here. I'm sure we'll talk in more detail around various aspects of this.
Excellent. So Dhiraj, thanks a lot. And you gave me a good segue into what I was going to ask as probably the next question. You mentioned about it's been such a large space, and also more importantly, within healthcare, there are so many subsegments, right? Medtech, pharma, this can go on and on. And the other thing, which at least I have observed over the last 2 decades, is that there are many areas to add value in general healthcare, but it's not easy to monetize all of them, right? It's a bit of a challenge, at least when you think about the Indian context. Now, how do you all think about what are the sub-segments, right? The areas where you see opportunities, and what are the areas where you are a bit wary about, right? At least more importantly, I think the Indian context. Should we start with you, Prem, given that you guys have a very, very wide set of early stage, mid stage, late stage, and also I think just the breadth of things that you have done?
No, I'm so happy to kick off here, Manish. Maybe I'll talk about our own evolution, because I think it provides a nice flavor of the types of themes, etc., that we've seen over the years. And I'll start with an anecdote. When I moved back to India to join Eight Roads or Fidelity Growth Partners, as we were called then, it was hard for me to justify spending even 40-50% of my time on the healthcare sector, though I tried very hard. Just not enough critical mass in terms of deal inflow, opportunities, interesting things to look at. But if I fast forward to today, we have a team of now 11 people who are exclusively focused on the sector. And we are still very, very crunched for capacity. We could easily do with a few more team members. Our thesis, though, has remained the same over the last decade. I think our thesis is that India presents a great opportunity to build category leaders across the healthcare value chain, both within established segments and then also emerging segments. When I think about established segments, India has always had 2 segments that have been more established, one being pharmaceuticals and the other being the broader services sector. Where we have found opportunities there, it has largely been opportunities where we think you can win even coming from behind. But even there, we have tried to find strong elements of differentiation or positioning. So if I look back at our first manufacturing investment in 2012, API manufacturing company called Laurus Labs, it was amongst the few then that spoke of having one manufacturing standard for the world in a sector in 2012 where most API companies had a manufacturing standard for India, one for the semi-regulated markets, and then a different one for the regulated countries. Similar with the hospital sector, we have a tier 2 investment strategy there. We've had one. And we've also looked at US manufacturing for formulations with companies such as IIMA Pharmaceuticals, where we built a manufacturing facility in New Jersey. And so that's how we have thought about the established segment or the established sectors. When I think about emerging themes and segments, they have, and I think, positively changed and evolved over the years and also deepened. And we've had the privilege of investing in a variety of themes, I think, right from biologics manufacturing to consumer health and our partnership with Cipla, building out a large entity there, animal health, digital health, where we invested in the largest online pharmacy business in the country called PharmEasy. And then in recent years, I think a theme I'm very excited about, which is broader innovation and drug discovery. As I think about path forward, of course, I think life is very different now, Manish, as compared to the pre-COVID era. And I think unfortunate discontinuities like COVID, as we have looked outside in, have created lots of opportunities and pivots for the sector. But I'd say there are three broader themes that I think are interesting from an Indian context going forward. Number one is manufacturing. I think as Shashank mentioned, a lot of the pre-COVID focus was on efficiency. How do you make supply chains global? How do you make them efficient? How do you think about outsourcing? But COVID has forced an inward look, and every country, whether it is India, whether it's the US, is now saying, look, how do I make my supply chain more resilient? Next time there is a pandemic, I want the supply chain to bounce back really quickly. And that's why you see this wave of manufacturing coming back to India, especially when you think about raw materials, intermediates, API. In fact, even in the US is now thinking very actively about a local API manufacturing. But our hope and what we're beginning to see is that manufacturing is coming back to India, but in what I call a version, quote unquote, version 2.0 strategy. It's coming back with cleaner models, cleaner chemistry. It's coming back with more scalable processes. And so I think you have the opportunity to rebuild another set of category leaders in the sector. So that's one. Number two, I can't talk about post-COVID without talking about digital health. So of course, digital health. And I think digital health, I think all and any barrier to digital health has been broken through COVID, right? I think having a digital consultation with a physician, getting medication at home, getting diagnostics at home, all of that has been broken. And of course, we have seen tailwinds even as we look at pharmacy and its growth. But I think the question to ask is, look, what is next? How will digital health evolve? How do you continue to sustainably penetrate the healthcare value chain digitally? I think on the B2C side, we see that happening. And the questions we ask are, look, how do you continue to drive access? How do you continue to break this information asymmetry between the patient and the physician? How do you use digital health to drive a focus on wellness rather than just prevention of disease, rather than just treatment of disease? I think the second aspect, and Manish, look, I think you're the expert here, but the second aspect that I'm quite interested in is on the business side, as you think about a post-COVID world and the new normal, wherein many functions, whether it's trials, whether it's manufacturing, people think about, look, how there will be reduced in-person interaction. And how do you use digital health technologies to be able to continue to think about monitoring global supply chains, global development of drugs and clinical trials in a post-COVID world? So I think that's second. The third aspect is innovation. If I look back pre-COVID, a lot of the drug discovery focus around the world has been on disease areas that have also been associated with niche indications and higher price points. You look at a lot of drug discovery on the oncology side, orphan drugs, rare diseases, etc. But I think what COVID has done is that it has reignited interest and attention in the mass market therapies, infectious diseases, vaccine development. My hope is that this will spawn a renewed wave of interest even in India as you think about drug discovery and innovation, and I think a topic that is close to our heart. But so we are of course seeing vaccine developers, we're seeing vaccine production, and then the hope is we continue to see more and more flavor there as we look at drug discovery. Look, I can go on and on, but I'll stop there, Manish.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very, very elaborate and helpful. And one of the interesting things, I think digital health has been something pretty much everyone is talking about. But what I found, the whole focus back on primary care, which had got neglected, is interesting one. Thank you. So Dhiraj, shall we move on to you? What is your take on the segments, sub-segments, so many things which you alluded to?
Sure. And as a late stage fund, we struggle to back very early stage innovation, right? So while we find a lot of interesting stuff in that area, it's not something that our filter allows us to invest into. Our approach tends to be really, I mean, demand and growth is obviously a big part of the equation. And frankly, sitting in India and looking at healthcare, that tends to throw up an easy answer. There is obviously this is a sunrise sector and you see a lot of opportunity. But then we apply the filters which are common to investing across sectors, which would be, how predictable is the business? What are the moats? Are they doing something fairly unique? And is the business model sustainable when it comes to all the stuff we learned at business school? Does it translate in the numbers or not? Right? And we tend to be more bottom up. So we look at the sector, but we don't pick up a theme and say we've got to find a play there. We will look at businesses and see if it meets the criteria that we're looking for. And more importantly, is it the management team we can work well with? Do they have the ambition and are we a relevant partner to them? When you apply those filters in India, I think by and large, the good thing is there's a lot of opportunity. I mentioned a few spaces, but if I were to just take the experience that we've got two investments in what I would call as retail health. We invested in a diagnostic chain, Dr. Lal's, back in the day, almost now 10 years ago. And the business did quite well. It's a listed company today. We have an IVF chain, which is today, again, the largest in the country. And both these areas have benefited from, also aggregation of demand towards more organized and better run national chains in some ways. And then there is an injection of, talent that somebody like us tends to do, which is around either the management team or the board, and helps, frankly, enable the business to more aggressively pursue the market opportunity. So that continues to remain an interesting theme from our perspective. In pharma, we see good scale opportunities, and we recognize the fact that and Indian pharma has also gone through its cycles, but I do think that it's reached a point of maturity today. Also post a lot of the US FDA scrutiny and so on, where quality players have emerged at scale. But for a private equity player, I think the filter does remain a little bit on what is more unique about what they do. It could be, a Shilpa Medicare, where we are an investor, which is very oncology formulations focused, and that becomes our theme. Or an Ideal Cures, which is, they make coatings for oral solid drugs, a very high value added business with very nice margins and effectively a derivative of what you see in pharma. So we look for some of these, nuances in the investments we do. I think in terms of where we've probably not done enough and is where the filters have held us back. So it could be, stuff like pharmacy, e-commerce and distribution, or frankly, even in pharma manufacturing, we've struggled a little bit where businesses are very, very capital intensive and need constant capex to be able to grow. That makes it tougher. And back in the day when we did Dr. Lal's, I think a lot of investments would go into the hospital space. Now, there's clearly a very nice thesis around demand because the country does need more infrastructure. But for the returns that somebody like us targets, I think it's probably not the best form of capital, was at least our conclusion on that. The last piece I would touch upon is the HCIT sector. And Manish, you run a business in that space. But it's largely focused where you're using the Indian talent and the Indian sort of ecosystem to be able to address the US healthcare industry need. And we've got a lot of experience in the US just covering managed care and looking at how healthcare costs get optimized in the US context. Use of technology coming out of India, to our mind, is a very interesting way to play healthcare here.
Excellent, thank you. Shashank, how about you? What is your take on the sub-segments? You also alluded to that briefly.
Yeah, I did, and I think I'd echo a lot of the themes that Dhiraj talked about. Our firms are not too dissimilar, although we tend to do a bit more buyouts than TA does. But really, I'd say we take a kind of global approach to this, Manish, and that's kind of our strategy across all of our sectors. Within healthcare globally, the things that we have done a lot of are medtech, where we've done a number of deals in various segments, and healthier medtech is in India is yet another one in that theme. We like pharma, we like healthcare IT. and specialized healthcare services. By that, I don't mean provider, which again, I agree with a lot of the comments Dhiraj made, which is, in fact, our first deal in India was in hospitals, in Apollo hospitals. But, by now, where growth, capital returns, and multiples have gotten for that sector, it feels something more attuned towards infrastructure fund type returns or sovereign type plays rather than out and out private equity. But those things that I talked about on a global level are very applicable and relevant for India. MedTech, as I mentioned, we already own India's leading independent MedTech. Of course, MedTech, just to frame this for everyone, and as I said earlier, I'm not the healthcare expert, but it feels like pharma 20 years ago, Indian pharma 20 years ago, where the market was dominated by the multinationals. You had some of these upstart Indian players, and you fast forward to 2020, the multinationals have been wiped out. The domestic formulations market is really dominated by Indian companies, who of course did hone their skills serving the global markets and so on, but nevertheless, they're the ones that dominate. And MedTech is the same reverse. It's 85 multinational, 15 Indian, and it shouldn't be. We don't have a healthcare system or an economy that can support and buy products that were developed in New Jersey for a different market at a different price point, and depend on those things being imported into the country. So I think Healthium is our first attempt at that, but I think there is a big runway for Indian medtech companies to develop products in India for the Indian market, and indeed take that where those products have traction and world-class quality and global scale, take those globally. That's exactly what Healthium is doing. The other space I would sort of highlight from an Apax perspective is pharma. We've talked about Indian pharma serving the rest of the world, but I was talking to, again, someone who's very experienced and understands the Chinese pharma market. And what this guy said was eye-opening for me, which is, he said, look, China and India have a population that's roughly the same size. And yet the Chinese pharma market, domestic pharma market, is $150 billion today.
Yeah.
And the Indian pharma market is just a shade over 20 billion.
Yeah.
And it should not be that big a delta. And yes, there's a difference in GDP and per capita GDP and all the rest of it, but healthcare is healthcare. And he says, I have plenty of, this guy was a consultant, he said, I have plenty of US clients, US pharma clients, who each have $5 billion businesses in China, right? Single client, and that play in $150 billion domestic pharma market. And if you look forward 20 years in India, I think we're going to see that kind of growth. So pharma, domestic pharma particularly, remains an area of strong interest, and everything that goes with that, right? APIs, CDMO, CRO, the final formulations, and of course, I think despite the issues, and Prem also referred to this with supply chains, I still do think India as a base to serve the rest of the world will continue in the future. So those are all strong areas of interest for us.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. So let's come back to you, Prem. I was looking at your site, and one of the things which is given up your profile, one of your motivations is to create companies and entrepreneurs who are successful at a global scale in healthcare. So what is your advice for entrepreneurs or companies trying to build really globally successful companies out of India?
I think my learning, I have two learnings over the past decade, and perhaps from some scars on my back. Number one, I think building a world-class healthcare company always takes twice as longer than you anticipate. And number two, also takes twice as much money as you anticipate. It is a sector that requires a lot of patience. Sales cycles are longer. Getting into customers takes longer, but if you stay the course and you stay the path, getting regulatory approvals takes its own time. But if you stay the course and you stay the path, once you begin to get into customers and begin to service, their product needs or other needs, displacing you becomes quite difficult. We've seen that over and over again. We've seen that with Loris. We've seen that with an enzymes company that we backed back back a few years ago called Richcore. We've seen that across sectors and segments. Number two, I think this is a really interesting time to be an entrepreneur because I think if you look back a decade, you more or less had options only in pharma and in services. I think you, of course, stood out, Manish, as someone who built a digital health company, but you also started with a services background, and then I think over the years built out a very strong digital backbone. But I think today there is opportunity across the board. I think there is opportunity when you think about consumer health. I think India has very few pure play consumer health companies, right? Even if you look at globally, every large pharma company has a large consumer health company. You have independents, but India has very few of them. You think about med tech, we don't have, quote unquote, the Mindray equivalent in India. We don't have a full service med tech company in the country. Both on the equipment side, you have large players, but you don't have behemoths, both on the equipment side, but then also on the consumable side, right? And India should be able to support at least a few of these. When you look at the digital health ecosystem, I think we have the ability to produce some very large companies across. So I think it's a very interesting time to be an entrepreneur. You have the opportunity to focus on or build companies that are either India focused, India for India, or India for the world, across each of these sectors, whether it's pharma, services, digital health, etc. And I think that you also have investor appetite and a critical mass of investors to be able to start these companies earlier. I think even if I look at 5-6 years ago, there were very few investors willing to fund healthcare companies at an early stage. I think you saw a lot of that interest on the tech side, but very little on the healthcare side. That is beginning to change. It's slow, but there is a definite change in that. In fact, we find that as we look globally, our best returns are coming from companies where we are coming in almost as co-founders with the entrepreneur. We've built China's largest biologics manufacturing facility, which is now a $10 billion entity called Innovent, listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. We've built companies both on the rare disease side, neuroscience side, multiple companies that have gone public on the US stock exchanges that have all been companies where we've come in as quote unquote co-founders along with entrepreneurs. So I think your ability to start companies early, get capital to begin to build and then grow from there has also changed quite a bit. So overall, great time to be an entrepreneur, Manish, in the healthcare sector.
Excellent. Thank you. Dhiraj, let me move on to you. I still remember meeting you probably after Lal had gone IPO, and you were very happy. You bought me a coffee in Oberoi right after that, right? Now, let's do some crystal ball gazing over here. That 5 years later, meet again. So which are the sectors you would think you or somebody else would be happy about big success stories in the segments of healthcare, at least from this market?
I'm not sure I have a very direct, straightforward answer to that question, Manish, because it's hard to pick winners from themes. It really comes down so much to what an entrepreneur or a management team delivers over a period of time, right? And I was just reflecting on the question you asked, Prem, which is what would you tell an entrepreneur today? I've asked this question of some of our successful entrepreneurs. And if they look back and say, what did they get right over a period of time? they've told me a few things which I would like to share. One is, pick somebody to work with you as a co-founder or a partner, because it gets pretty lonely otherwise. And nobody is perfect. Nobody's the full package. If you get good partners alongside you, then chances are the journey is going to be more fun and more successful, right? And the other is, if you have to raise capital, do it with somebody who has a similar agenda as yours. Try and align with it, right? So somebody like us, if we come in, we will think of value creation in a certain time period. We'll have a certain appetite for the ups and downs and the risks. Um, and it's important that we're not debating every decision, because we are trying to solve different objectives.
Yeah.
So it's, if we think of value creation as saying, okay, you've got to invest in the business, but ensure that you're not looking for a next round of funding to keep the business, to keep the lights on, then it's important that the stage of the business supports that thesis. Otherwise, we're just going to be misfits. Can we add value is an important question. If so, in what areas? Because it's one thing in courtship to say, let's talk about all the stuff we can do for each other, but you've got to translate that into stuff that you can live with post the partnership starting off. And to our mind, we also keep looking for just these things. I mean, we love domestic pharma, for instance, to Shashank's point earlier, but we haven't been able to invest for various reasons, and that's okay. And our next deal might be in that space. We do think that HCIT is a great space. Again, we're waiting to make the investment there. But along the way, we ended up investing in an IVF chain, which wasn't necessarily front and center of our thought process. But as we looked at the space, as we looked at the player, as we understood what we can do to create value and what the business wanted to achieve, we felt pretty aligned, and I think we got there. I hope I'll have wins to talk about and buy you more than a coffee, but we'll see.
I was going to say that was that you got off pretty light, Dhiraj, and Manish, you should have pushed him for more than a coffee.
No, it was 10 in the morning, otherwise I would have. No? Excellent. So let's move on to you, Shashank. So I'm going to club two questions and ask you in one go, given to be more careful about time. One is that over the last 6 months or so, there have been huge amount of announcements, your peers, right? There have been very large sector-specific healthcare funds getting announced, or right, people talking about and fairly large, couple of $1 billion dedicated funds on the drug discovery, biotech side, and a huge amount of themes, right? And a lot of talk about headlines around that. So what is the broad thesis you think which is going on in global markets around some of this stuff? That's my question number one. And second, the same question I asked Prem and what Dhiraj spoke about, your advice to entrepreneurs trying to build super successful companies out of India.
Sure. So look, on healthcare specific funds, I can't comment, right? Because I to be honest, I haven't studied the stats to say, look, are more funds getting raised now that are healthcare sector specific than were 5 years ago, etc. Intuitively, it makes sense because, as we talked about at the start of this call, there is more focus on healthcare. People, more attention, more probably a shifting of fund allocation as well, whether explicit or implicit, towards healthcare because it is defensive, it is required. The pandemic has opened the world's eyes to areas of significant underinvestment that have happened in the past, and therefore, people are piling in. I mean, we can see it in some of our portfolio companies. As an example, we own a company called Vire, which is the world's leading independent manufacturer of ventilators. I mean, respiratory devices, but specifically also ventilators. And you can imagine what's happened to their demand and revenue in this period. So people see that, then they say, look, I want to do more of that, and therefore let me raise a dedicated fund, etc. I mean, there's been $16 trillion of monetary stimulus that's been pumped into global markets, right, in the last 6 months. That money's got to end up somewhere as well. But I don't have a specific answer to your question, Manish. In terms of the sort of what question answered, addressed by both Prem and Dhiraj, what would I tell entrepreneurs? I actually agree with what both Prem and Dhiraj have said, which is look, it's a great time to be an entrepreneur today, and not just in healthcare, more broadly, because of this fact that there is so much capital. um, you know, it will chase all opportunities. And so then it's all about what is your best setup to make sure that you are able to deliver on that opportunity. It's also, by the way, a hugely disruptive time for lots and lots of incumbents in lots and lots of industries, right? Digital is a massive disruptor. It disrupts business models and value chains. uh, Playing field is leveling in a lot of industries. So you can be a new company that upsets, you know, a decades old incumbent in any number of sectors, including in healthcare. So that's kind of one point. The second point is, again, I'd say, you know, building on what Dhiraj said, look, in this environment of a lot of capital, don't be seduced by, you know, the fact that, look, this is the guy who's offering me the biggest check or the fattest valuation, etc. I mean, we've, you know, without naming names specifically, but we've seen one large tech investor, for example, flush with cash, largest fund ever raised, pumping money everywhere. And we've all seen kind of how that story has unfolded. Now, while the going was good, you know, you would have been thrilled to have been funded by you know, that particular fund. But you know, when they ran out of money, and they sort of then you know, the tide would have gone out very quickly. And having been partnered with them, you would have pivoted your business model. You would have been in high cash burn mode and so on and so forth. Suddenly, what do you do, right? So picking your partner carefully, alignment of long-term goals, like Dhiraj talked about, I think is also very, very important. Don't just go for the, you know, highest valuation. Don't just go for the biggest check. Go for the person who you think understands your business most, and will be the best partner.
Absolutely. So I think that's a very interesting theme which emerges from all three of you as advice for entrepreneurs, that if you are in healthcare, it takes time, right? There's no quick win, and hence getting a partner and thinking about it from a long-term perspective and being aligned to that is absolutely critical. So that's great advice, and I can completely relate and buy to that personally. I've been doing that for 20 years now. So now let me use the next few minutes to pick up some questions very quickly. There are a few questions we have. Okay, so let me take this one, which is an interesting question from my perspective also. Some Vivek Joshi is asking, growing businesses in drug development often mention that they run into difficulties in receiving funding. Then they need about 30-40 million from PE. They have to out-license or seek strategic partners. It's a very common thing in biotechs. To some extent, this is curtailing innovation in drug development. Any views if this will change? Prem, you want to talk about this? You spoke about drug discovery and development over here, and it's been a difficult environment for sure. But is it changing? What do you see?
Look, I think it has been a difficult environment even until a year and a half ago. I think and I would say for a couple of reasons. I think I think evaluating and investing in a drug discovery company requires a level of technical skill sets and a level of technical capabilities which we just haven't seen in the broader VC ecosystem in the country. So that's number one. Number two is the fact that the Indian market is still small. If I compare and contrast how China has evolved, where we have made quite a few drug discovery investments, taken companies public, you require a large enough market so that you can create a India for India or a China for China drug discovery company. And number two, you need a capital market that is willing to absorb these companies, pre-revenue companies, companies with pipeline drugs that can go public, a set of public market investors and analysts who are able to understand the risk and value these companies, which does not exist in the country today. Number three is India has, and therefore by definition, most of the drug discovery companies that you see in India are India for the US market.
Yeah.
And then you are largely being compared with the plethora of drug discovery startups in the same therapeutic area, same disease category that you see in the US. So even when we evaluate drug discovery companies that are India for the US, then we have to compare them across our funds with all the other 5 companies that we're seeing and then say, look, India has great chemistry talent. Biology talent is still nascent, of course, emerging and growing. But we don't have the clinical development skills. We don't have some of the skills in terms of saying what's the best trial design to, develop a set of indications and things like that. And therefore, you find that the Indian companies unfortunately fall behind in terms of securing funding. Of course, that's changing, and you've got a few outliers that are emerging. And for the sake of the country, I hope more and more emerge and more companies get bought out. But it will take a few success stories, Manish, for some of this to play out. Set up. I think the model that might work, and we're seeing some of it, is you have a US front end, you have an India back end for development. So you get the best of both worlds. You get early funding, perhaps from India, from the US, but then you can also tap into the US funding pool for further investments. In fact, we've been looking for a couple of years now for a drug discovery company. We just made our first investment 6 months ago in a oncology-focused CAR-T therapeutics company alongside Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw called Immunil. But that's focused, I think I'm very excited, it's focused on the Indian market. How do you provide next generation therapies for blood cancer at a price that is affordable for the Indian population? So as this market evolves and grows, you will see more and more of India for India startups. But today, a lot of it is India for the US and therefore needs to compete with the US landscape.
Sure. Thank you. So I'll take one more question. There is a question on by Kazi. He's asking, thanks for interesting that the words regulator and FDA haven't come up today at all so far, which is actually a good point. Would be curious to hear the panelists' views on COVID, how COVID will change regulatory risk investments in this space. So, and if any of you want to take this?
I can take it. We've seen a couple of those. I think through COVID, I think the regulator has now said that they can manage an audit without being there in person, so a remote audit. Interestingly, we have a company that is headquartered in the US, and they faced their first FDA audit last month. And they said that the auditor came and spent a couple of weeks. And this was an auditor who would otherwise come to India. So, typically the perception is maybe the Indian companies see a very difficult audit and sometimes the US companies might get away. But they said, look, this was the hardest audit we've faced because the auditor came and he said, I have nowhere to go through COVID. And so I'm going to spend not just 3-4 days, but I'm going to spend a good couple of weeks with you auditing your facility. So I thought that was quite interesting. But I think that will also change. Look, you can't get away from not having an in-person audit, Manish. Yeah. Maybe there's a balance that will be struck, which is a first in-person audit, maybe subsequent audits are not in person. I think you will also see the FDA thinking through technology, is my guess, a little more aggressively. And how can you use technology for remote monitoring, making sure facilities are always in a state of preparedness, etc. But I think it depends on how long the pandemic lasts, and the FDA certainly is not going to allow drug shortages to escalate beyond what they are today.
I'll just add maybe a sentence or two, right? And regulation is an interesting topic, no matter which sector you pick, especially in the Indian context. One of my partners talked about it when we were having a management meeting where he said, we spend 30-40% of our time discussing regulation. In most other parts of the world, it wouldn't have been a topic. So I think that comes with, frankly, most businesses in India and healthcare more so, and probably rightfully so, because there is a larger public aspect to what gets done, right? When it's delivery, whether it's primary care, tertiary, whatever. So there will always be regulatory overhang and intervention. And to a large extent, the onus does remain on businesses and companies to find ways to keep raising the bar. And that I'm talking in the context of, frankly, domestic regulation, but it's also true when it comes to export markets and regulated markets. We've seen the price that the pharma industry has paid where they've struggled to comply with norms. And I think the better ones will just say, I've just got to go and set the bar so high that I don't face challenges, or if I do, then I'm able to deal with it. And I think that's the cost of doing business. If you want to do it the right way and build company and value over long term, you'll have to ensure that it's not a risk to your business. Regulation is not a risk to your business.
No, absolutely. And particularly so in healthcare. So regulators will remain, but I could add a line over here. We're clearly seeing that FDA and regulators across the world becoming, on one hand, much more adaptive, working very closely with companies and also adopting technology in a very significant way, especially FDA, which has been I would say it was happening before the pandemic, but it's accelerated over the last 6 months in a very significant way. We've run out of time, so I don't think we can take any more questions. I've been asked to close this by 7. And we are pretty much on the dot. So once again, let me thank all of you, Shashank, Prem, and Dhiraj, for this absolutely wonderful discussion. Let me also once again thank IIMA, Anurag, Vidhi, and all of them for organizing this. Last but not least, my partners in SIG, Sudarshan Jain, Professor Pingali, we've been working closely for this healthcare SIG, and as I mentioned right at the beginning, it for you guys. Sudarshan ji has been one of those driving forces for making a lot of this happen. So thanks a lot to them as well. Once again, thank you, and you have a great evening. Thanks all, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you, Manish, for the excellent moderation.
Thanks, Manish.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Anurag. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.